June 12, 1944. Normandy, France. Dawn. The sun had not yet burned through the coastal fog when Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt first heard the sound. It was not the crack of rifles or the shriek of artillery that made his hands tighten around his binoculars. It was something else. A low, mechanical rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself, rolling across the hedgerows like distant thunder that refused to fade. He stood in the commander's hatch of his Panzer IV, scanning the tree line beyond the village of Villers-Bocage, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe it was only the morning wind moving through the Norman countryside. But the wind does not shake the ground. The wind does not smell of diesel and hot metal. And the wind does not grow louder with each passing second until it drowns out every other sound in the world. Then he saw them. They came through the morning mist like iron ghosts, dozens of them, hundreds of them, moving in columns that stretched back beyond the horizon. Sherman tanks, American Shermans. Their olive-drab hulls were caked with mud from the bocage, their white stars painted bold and defiant on their turrets. They moved with a mechanical certainty, engines growling, tracks clanking against stone and earth, each one followed by another and another and another in an endless procession that seemed to mock every principle of armored warfare Reinhardt had learned at the tank schools in Münsterlager. This was not how Panzer doctrine worked. This was not how wars were won. Quality over quantity, precision over mass, the superiority of German engineering over the crude industrial output of a nation that knew nothing of military tradition. And yet they kept coming. Reinhardt had been told by his commanders, by his fellow officers, by the propaganda pamphlets distributed to every panzer crew in France that the American Sherman was a death trap, a tin coffin, a poorly armored, undergunned joke of a tank that would burn at the first hit from a German 75mm gun. The Americans called them Shermans. The British called them M4s. The Germans had a different name, Tommy Cookers, because of how quickly they caught fire when penetrated. One shot, they said, and the Sherman would brew up like a tea kettle, its crew consumed in seconds by flames fueled by gasoline engines and poorly protected ammunition. Reinhardt had believed this. Every panzer commander believed this. It was not propaganda. It was observable fact. In the battles around Caen, in the hedgerow fighting west of St. Lo, German tanks had knocked out Shermans with cold efficiency, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single engagement, before the Americans even located the source of fire. But on that June morning, watching the endless columns grinding forward through the Norman countryside, Klaus Reinhardt understood for the first time that he had been asking the wrong question. The question was not whether a Sherman could survive against a Panther or a Tiger. The question was whether Germany could survive against 50,000 Shermans. And on that morning, as the fog lifted and the full scale of the American armored tide became visible, Reinhardt knew the answer. The Sherman tank was never supposed to be the symbol of American industrial might. When the United States Army began developing its medium tank doctrine in the late 1930s, the goal was modest: create a reliable, mass-producible tank that could support infantry operations and engage enemy armor when necessary. The result was the M3 Lee, a crude interim design with a hull-mounted 75mm gun that was obsolete before it left the factory. But the M3 taught American engineers something vital: that tanks could be built quickly, in vast numbers, using standardized parts and assembly line techniques borrowed from the automobile industry. When the M4 Sherman entered production in February 1942, it inherited this philosophy. It was not the best tank in the world. It was not intended to be. It was intended to be good enough, reliable enough, and above all, numerous enough to overwhelm any enemy through sheer mechanical persistence. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, American factories were producing Shermans at a rate that defied comprehension. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, the Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal, the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pittsburgh, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company in Renton, Washington, the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, the Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing Company in Chicago. 11 major plants, dozens of subcontractors, an industrial network that stretched across the entire American continent, all focused on a single objective: build more tanks than the enemy could possibly destroy. At peak production in March 1943, American factories were completing one Sherman tank every 45 minutes. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 Shermans would roll off American assembly lines, more than all German tank production combined from 1939 to 1945. The Germans looked at these numbers and saw madness. How could a nation prioritize quantity over quality? How could they send their tankers into battle in machines that were demonstrably inferior to German designs? The Panther tank had a 75mm high-velocity gun that could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding a mile. The Tiger I had an 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman from distances so great the American crew would never even see their killer. German armor was thicker, German guns were more powerful, German optics were superior. On paper, in controlled tests, in every metric that mattered to military engineers, the German tanks were better. And yet the Shermans kept coming, kept burning, kept being replaced. For every Sherman knocked out in Normandy, 3 more would arrive from the beaches. For every American tanker killed, another would climb into a fresh tank and continue the advance. The Germans had built superior machines, the Americans had built a superior system. Hauptmann Ernst Bauer encountered his first Sherman on July 8, 1944, south of Caen, in the fields when his summer wheat had been trampled into mud by a week of fighting. He was commanding a Panther Aufs G, one of the finest tanks in the Wehrmacht inventory, and he had been told that morning by his battalion commander that the American armor was nothing to fear, just keep your distance and use
your gun's advantage. Bauer was a veteran of the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kursk. He had seen Soviet T-34s by the hundreds, and he had learned that survival meant striking first and moving fast. When he spotted the Sherman, a lone M4A1 moving along a sunken road between 2 hedgerows, he did not hesitate. The Panther's 75mm gun fired. The high-velocity round crossed the 800 meters between tanks in less than a second. It struck the Sherman's right front hull at a slight angle, punched through the armor plating, and detonated inside the crew compartment. The effect was immediate. Smoke poured from the hatches. Flames licked up from the engine deck. 3 of the 5-man crew bailed out, their uniforms burning, and collapsed in the ditch beside the road. Bauer watched through his periscope as the Sherman brewed up exactly as promised, a perfect kill, a textbook engagement. He ordered his driver to reverse into cover behind a stone barn, and he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. Then the next Sherman appeared, and the one after that, and 3 more behind those. They did not come with tactical sophistication. They did not attempt to flank or maneuver. They simply came forward, one after another, their commanders knowing that the Panther could not reload fast enough to stop them all. Bauer's gunner knocked out 2 more before the Americans located his position. The 4th Sherman fired a 75mm high-explosive shell that missed the Panther but collapsed half the barn wall, filling the crew compartment with dust and shattered stone. The 5th Sherman fired a white phosphorus round that ignited the wooden structure and forced Bauer to order his driver to back out of cover. By the time the Panther reached the tree line 300 meters away, 7 Shermans were advancing across the field. Bauer had 5 armor-piercing rounds remaining. He could kill 5 more Shermans, but there would be 20 more behind them, and 50 more behind those, and 100 more unloading from landing craft on the beaches of Normandy every single day. Ernst Bauer survived that engagement. His Panther did not. An American M10 tank destroyer, another design the Germans had dismissed as inadequate, flanked his position from a parallel road and put a 76mm round through the Panther's side armor at 200 meters. Bauer and his crew bailed out seconds before the ammunition exploded. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in England, and in the decades that followed, he would tell interviewers that the finest tank he ever commanded was defined not by superior American engineering, but by something far more devastating: the absolute certainty that no matter how many Shermans he destroyed, there would always be more. The men who crewed the Shermans knew they were riding in death traps. They were not fools, and they were not blind to the mathematics of armored combat. A Sherman's frontal armor was 51mm thick, sloped at 56 degrees, effective against machine gun fire and low-velocity anti-tank weapons, but hopelessly inadequate against the German 75mm and 88mm guns that dominated the battlefield. The Sherman's own 75mm M3 gun could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor only at point-blank range, and even then only with a perfect shot against the turret mantlet or lower glacis plate.
In a direct one-on-one engagement at combat ranges, a Sherman had almost no chance of survival against a panther and no chance at all against a tiger. The crews knew this. They painted the statistics on the walls of their barracks. They whispered the kill ratios in the chow lines. 4 Shermans lost for every panther destroyed. 5 Shermans for every tiger. These were not official figures. The U.S. Army kept such data classified. But the tankers knew. They counted the burned-out hulls along the roads. They attended the funerals of friends who had climbed into a Sherman at dawn and been pulled out in pieces by nightfall. They learned to recognize the sound of German armor-piercing rounds penetrating steel, a sharp metallic crack, followed by the screaming of men and the roar of igniting ammunition. They called the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lights first time every time. And yet they climbed into those tanks every morning. They started the engines, checked the ammunition, adjusted their headsets, and rolled forward into combat against an enemy they knew possessed superior weaponry. Why? Sergeant Michael Pappas of the 2nd Armored Division, who fought from Normandy to the Elbe River, offered one explanation in a letter to his sister written in August 1944. "We know the Kraut tanks are better. We know we're going to lose boys every time we meet them head-on. But we also know something they don't. We know that for every tank they knock out, we've got 5 more waiting in the rear. We know that when their Panther breaks down, and those fancy German machines break down a lot, they've got no spare parts, no mechanics, no replacement. But when our Sherman throws a track or burns out a transmission, we've got a new one by the next morning. We can afford to lose tanks. They can't." That's not courage, sis. That's just math. The mathematics of attrition. The calculus of industrial war. The Sherman was not designed to win individual duels. It was designed to win campaigns. And in the summer of 1944, as American armor poured across France in numbers that stunned even the Allied high command, the Sherman tank did exactly what it was built to do. It kept moving forward, kept absorbing losses, kept being replaced, until the German panzer divisions, outnumbered, outgunned by sheer volume, and starved of fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles, simply ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. There was a sound that haunted the German tank crews in France that summer. It was not the roar of the Sherman's engines or the clank of its tracks. It was the radio chatter. The constant, undisciplined, almost casual flow of American voices over the airwaves, talking to each other in a language most Germans could not understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. There was no fear in those voices, no desperation, no sense that the men speaking were fighting for survival. They sounded like factory workers coordinating a shift change, like truck drivers discussing a delivery route. The Germans, trained in strict radio discipline, speaking only in terse coded phrases, found this deeply unnerving. It suggested an enemy who did not view armored combat as a life or death struggle between elite warriors, but as a logistical problem to be solved through coordination and overwhelming resources. And they were right. The American approach to armored warfare was fundamentally different from the German model. The Wehrmacht viewed the tank as a weapon of maneuver, a tool for breakthrough and exploitation, crewed by specially trained soldiers who formed an elite within the army. Panzer divisions were precious assets, carefully husbanded, committed to battle only at decisive moments. When a German tank was destroyed, it represented not just a loss of equipment, but a loss of highly trained personnel and irreplaceable mechanical expertise. The Americans, by contrast, viewed the tank as they viewed every other piece of military equipment, as a standardized, replaceable component in an industrial system. Shermans were not precious, they were expendable. The crews were trained in a matter of weeks, not years. The tanks themselves were designed for ease of maintenance, with interchangeable parts and simple mechanical systems that could be repaired by ordinary mechanics rather than specialized technicians. When a Sherman was knocked out, another Sherman would take its place within hours. When a crew was lost, another crew, fresh from training camps in Texas or Kentucky or California, would arrive within days. This was the true genius of the Sherman tank, and it was a genius that had nothing to do with armor thickness or gun penetration. It was the genius of American industrial culture, of an economy so vast and so productive that it could afford to treat tanks the way other nations treated rifles, as mass-produced tools to be used, discarded, and replaced without sentimentality or hesitation. The Germans had built beautiful machines, marvels of engineering that represented the pinnacle of mechanical design. The Americans had built a system, and in total war, systems beat machines every time.
By August 1944, the German commanders in France began to file reports that
their superiors in Berlin found difficult to believe. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German panzer doctrine, read field assessments describing American armored columns that stretched for 15 kilometers, moving in broad daylight with no apparent concern for air attack or ambush. He read accounts of Sherman battalions that absorbed 50% casualties in a single engagement and resumed the attack the following morning with full strength, the losses made good overnight by a logistics network that seemed capable of miracles. He read intercepted American radio traffic that discussed tank maintenance in the same casual terms one might use to discuss changing the oil in a civilian automobile. Guderian was not a stupid man. He understood what these reports meant. He had spent his career advocating for mobile, mechanized warfare, for the concentration of armored forces at decisive points, for the rapid exploitation of breakthroughs before the enemy could react. But all of that doctrine was predicated on the assumption that tanks were relatively scarce, that they had to be used wisely, that losses could not be easily replaced. The Americans had invalidated that assumption. They had brought so many tanks to France that they could afford to use them wastefully, to throw them against fortified positions in frontal assaults that would have been suicidal for any other army, to absorb casualties that would have crippled a German panzer division and simply continue the advance as if nothing had happened. In a meeting with Hitler on August 31, 1944, Guderian tried to explain this new reality. Mein Führer, he said, according to the notes of an adjutant present at the meeting, the Americans are not fighting us with superior tactics or superior training. They are fighting us with an industrial capacity we cannot match. For every tank we destroy, they field 3 more. For every liter of fuel we burn, they bring 100 liters forward. We are not losing battles. We are being buried under the weight of American production. Hitler, famously, did not want to hear this. He responded with a furious tirade about German will, about the
superiority of German soldiers, about the inevitable failure of the mongrel American army once it encountered true resistance. But Guderian, walking out of that meeting into the ruins of a Berlin already pockmarked by Allied bombing, knew the truth. The war was not being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, in the shipyards of California, in the foundries and assembly plants of a nation that could build 50,000 tanks and still have industrial capacity left over for aircraft, artillery, trucks, and every other implement of modern war. Germany had built the finest tanks in the world. America had built more tanks than Germany could ever destroy. And in the end, that was the only statistic that mattered. The symbolic power of the Sherman tank lay not in what it was, but in what it represented. To the American crews who fought in them, the Sherman was a flawed but reliable tool, a machine that would get them through the war if they were lucky and if they followed the tactics they had been taught. To the German soldiers who faced them, the Sherman became something else entirely, a physical manifestation of American abundance, a rolling embodiment of an industrial system so vast and so productive that it could afford to be wasteful. Every Sherman that appeared on the battlefield was a reminder that Germany was not fighting a war against armies, but against the combined economic output of a continent that had never known occupation, never known starvation, never known the material deprivation that had defined European life for 5 years. Consider the matter of food. This seems tangential to a discussion of armored warfare, but it is not. German tank crews in France in the summer of 1944 were subsisting on reduced rations, their supply lines interdicted by Allied aircraft, their logistics network crumbling under the weight of fuel shortages and partisan attacks. An average German soldier in Normandy received perhaps 2,000 calories per day, often in the form of black bread, ersatz coffee, and whatever could be scavenged.
From the countryside, an American soldier received more than 4,000 calories per day, delivered with mechanical regularity by a logistics system that could move supplies from American farms to French battlefields in a matter of weeks. American tankers ate bacon and eggs for breakfast. They drank real coffee. They received candy bars, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola as standard rations. When a Sherman battalion halted for the evening, the men would heat sea rations on the engine decks of their tanks. Canned beef stew, canned fruit cocktail, canned everything. While a few hundred meters away, German soldiers roasted potatoes over fires and wondered when the next supply convoy would arrive. This was psychological warfare of the most devastating kind. It was not intentional. The American military fed its soldiers well because it could, because the industrial and agricultural capacity of the United States made it easy to do so, but the effect on German morale was profound. Captured German soldiers in the late summer of 1944 would often speak not of American tactical superiority or weapon quality, but of American abundance, the endless flow of supplies, the sense that the Americans had so much material wealth that they could afford to be careless with it. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant, interrogated by American intelligence officers in September 1944, described watching an American supply convoy discard entire crates of rations that had gotten wet during transport. "They just left them by the roadside," he said, according to the interrogation transcript. "Food that could have fed my company for a week, and they treated it as garbage. That is when I knew we could not win." The Sherman tank was the mechanized version of those discarded ration crates. It was a weapon system built by a nation so wealthy that it could afford to lose 4 tanks to kill 1 enemy tank and consider it an acceptable exchange rate. The Germans could not conceive of warfare on these terms. Their entire military tradition was built on the idea of qualitative superiority, of elite troops using superior equipment to overcome numerical disadvantages. They had spent decades perfecting this approach, refining their doctrine, training their soldiers to standards that few other nations could match. And then, they encountered an enemy for whom quality was irrelevant, because quantity was infinite. The Battle of Arracourt, fought in eastern France in September 1944, became a case study in this clash of philosophies. The German 5th Panzer Army, equipped with the newest Panther tanks and veteran crews, launched a counterattack against the American 4th Armored Division near the town of Arracourt, hoping to halt the Allied advance toward the German border. On paper, the Germans had every advantage. They outnumbered the Americans in tanks. Their Panthers were superior in armor and firepower to the Shermans. The terrain, rolling farmland with scattered woodlots, favored defensive operations. German commanders were confident that they could inflict devastating casualties on the Americans and force them to halt their advance. The battle lasted 10 days. When it ended, the 5th Panzer Army had been effectively destroyed. The Germans lost 281 tanks, including 132 Panthers. The Americans lost 48 Shermans. But here is the critical detail. By the time the battle ended, the American 4th Armored Division was back to full strength. Every lost Sherman had been replaced. Every damaged tank had been repaired or swapped out for a fresh vehicle. The division's combat effectiveness was unchanged. The German 5th Panzer Army, by contrast, ceased to exist as a functional military unit. Its surviving tanks were dispersed to other formations. Its crews were reassigned. The organizational structure that had taken years to build was dismantled because the Wehrmacht simply did not have the resources to rebuild it. American after-action reports from Arracourt are remarkable for their clinical tone. They read like industrial quality control documents, cataloging losses and replacements with the same detachment a factory manager might use to discuss defective parts on an assembly line. 47 M4 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, one report noted. 52 replacement M4 tanks delivered from depot stocks. Division operational strength, 98%. There is no mourning in these documents, no sense of loss. Just a cold accounting of assets consumed and assets replaced. The Germans, reading captured American reports after the war, found this almost incomprehensible. Where was the human element? Where was the recognition that each destroyed tank represented 5 dead or wounded soldiers? The Americans seemed to view their own casualties with the same mechanical dispassion they applied to everything else, as if human beings were just another replaceable component in the industrial machine of war. And perhaps, in a sense, they were. This is not to say that American commanders were callous or that they did not mourn their dead, but the American military system was designed to function independent of individual losses. A Sherman crew that was killed could be replaced within days by another crew with equivalent training. A battalion commander who fell in battle could be replaced by his executive officer, who had been trained to assume command. The system was larger than any individual, more durable than any single unit, and it kept functioning regardless of casualties, because it was built to keep functioning. The Germans had created an army of specialists. The Americans had created a machine that ran on interchangeable parts. By the winter of 1944,
The symbolic meaning of the Sherman tank had shifted even in the minds of the men who crewed them. They still called them death traps. They still knew that a panther could kill them from a distance at which they had no hope of fighting back. But they also knew something that the Germans were only beginning to understand. They were winning. Not because the Sherman was a great tank, but because there were so many Shermans that victory had become a matter of arithmetic inevitability. For every burned-out hull they passed on the road to Germany, there were 10 more Shermans coming up behind them. For every friend they lost, there was another young man from Iowa or Texas or New York climbing into a tank and continuing the advance. The Germans could win every tactical engagement and still lose the war because the Americans had brought more tanks than Germany possessed artillery shells to destroy them. Lieutenant Paul Fairchild,
a Sherman platoon leader in the 3rd Armored Division, wrote in his diary on December 3, 1944, as his unit approached the German border. "We passed a knocked-out Panther today, one of the new ones with the fancy Zimmerit coating. Beautiful machine. Probably cost the Krauts 6 months of production time and a fortune in resources. It was sitting in a ditch with its turret blown off, surrounded by 3 dead Shermans. I'd guess the Panther got all 3 before someone flanked it or called in artillery. That's a kill ratio the Krauts would be proud of, 3 for 1. But here's the thing. Those 3 Shermans will be replaced by tomorrow. That Panther won't be replaced at all. We're grinding them down, one beautiful, expensive, irreplaceable German tank at a time, and I think they're starting to realize it." The German military had never planned for a long war of attrition. Their entire strategic doctrine, from Schlieffen to Guderian, was built on the concept of rapid, decisive victory. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactical system, it was a necessary response to Germany's strategic weakness. Germany lacked the raw materials for a protracted industrial war. It had no oil fields, limited steel production, and a population base that could not sustain massive casualties over multiple years. The German solution was to win quickly, to strike before the enemy could mobilize, to achieve decision through maneuver and superior tactics before the war devolved into a grinding match of production capacity. This had worked brilliantly in Poland, in France, even in the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. But by 1944, the Blitzkrieg was a memory, and Germany was trapped in exactly the kind of war it could not win. The Americans and British were not Poland or France. They could not be knocked out of the war with a single bold stroke. They had industrial economies that dwarfed Germany's, resource bases that included entire continents, and a willingness to accept casualties that suggested they viewed the war as an industrial process rather than a clash of national wills.
And so the Germans found themselves fighting a war of attrition with an enemy that could outproduce them 20 to 1, outsupply them 50 to 1, and replace losses faster than those losses could be inflicted. The Sherman tank was the perfect weapon for this kind of war. It was not elegant, it was not sophisticated. It was a crude, functional tool built by a nation that understood the difference between craftsmanship and mass production. The Germans had crafted masterpieces. The Americans had mass-produced victory. And as the Sherman columns rolled across the Rhine in early 1945, past the burned-out hulks of Panthers and Tigers and King Tigers, past the remnants of panzer divisions that had once been the most feared military formations in the world, it became clear which approach had been correct. In the final months of the war, German tank crews stopped mocking the Sherman. There was no point. The jokes about Tommy Cookers and Ronsons rang hollow when every engagement brought another wave of American armor, another wall of steel that could not be stopped, only delayed. The kill ratios remained in Germany's favor until the very end. German tanks were still superior in one-on-one combat, but the ratios no longer mattered. The war had stopped being about individual battles and had become about systemic collapse. Germany was running out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of replacement vehicles, out of trained crews, out of everything except the will to continue fighting a war that had already been lost. American Shermans, meanwhile, kept rolling forward. They crossed the Rhine, they punched through the Ruhr, they met the Soviets at the Elbe. And in every town they liberated, in every village they passed through, the civilian populations saw the same thing. An endless column of tanks, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all moving with mechanical precision, all supplied by a logistics network that seemed to have no limit.
The Germans had promised their people that superior German technology would overcome Allied material superiority, but the civilians watching the Americans roll past could do the math. 1 Sherman, 2 Shermans, 10 Shermans.
100 Shermans, more Shermans than anyone could count. And behind them, more trucks carrying more supplies than Germany had seen in years. This was not an army. This was an industrial nation on the move, and it could not be stopped by superior engineering or tactical brilliance or any amount of ideological fervor. The symbolic power of the Sherman tank outlasted the war itself. In the decades that followed, military historians and veterans would debate its merits endlessly. Was it a good tank? A bad tank? Should the Americans have built fewer Shermans and focused on developing a heavy tank that could match the Panther and Tiger? These debates missed the point. The Sherman was not designed to be a good tank in the abstract sense. It was designed to win the war, and it did exactly that. It won by being reliable when reliability mattered more than armor. It won by being simple when simplicity meant that field repairs could be made by ordinary mechanics. It won by being numerous when numbers were the only statistic that ultimately counted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, never had any illusions about the Sherman's technical limitations. He knew that German tanks were better in direct combat. But he also knew that the war would not be decided by individual tank duels. It would be decided by which side could maintain a continuous offensive, which side could replace losses faster than they were inflicted, which side could bring overwhelming material superiority to bear at every point along a 1,000-kilometer front. The Sherman allowed him to do that. It allowed him to plan operations knowing that tank losses, even heavy tank losses, would not compromise his offensive capability. It allowed him to tell his field commanders to keep attacking, keep pushing forward, because there would always be more tanks, more ammunition, more fuel, more of everything. In his memoirs, published in 1948, Eisenhower wrote, "The Sherman tank was criticized by some as being inferior to German armor, and in certain technical specifications this was true. But what won the war in Europe was not individual weapon superiority. It was the ability to put massive forces into the field and keep them supplied. The Sherman was the perfect tank for that kind of war. It could be built quickly, shipped efficiently, maintained easily, and replaced rapidly. It was, in short, the industrial expression of American power. And that power was decisive." On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, there were more than 20,000 Sherman tanks in Europe. They sat in motor pools from France to Czechoslovakia, their engines idling, their crews celebrating, their white stars visible for miles in every direction. They had done what they were designed to do. They had absorbed terrible losses. More than 4,000 Shermans were destroyed in combat during the 11 months from D-Day to VE Day. But they had kept moving forward, kept delivering the men and firepower necessary to crush German resistance, kept embodying the simple, brutal truth that the side with more resources would win. Klaus Reinhardt, the Oberleutnant who had watched the first Sherman columns roll through Normandy in June 1944, survived the war. He was captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945 and spent 3 months in an American POW camp before being released. Years later, in an interview conducted for a German television documentary, he was asked what he remembered most about fighting the Americans. He thought for a long moment before answering. "The tanks," he said. "Always the tanks. We would knock them out, 2, 3, 5 in a day, and we would think we had won. And then the next morning, there would be more. Always more. It was like fighting the ocean. You could bail water all day, and the ocean would still drown you. That is what the Shermans were. An ocean of steel. We called them death traps, and they were. But they were also something else. They were proof that we had been lied to. We had been told that German quality would defeat American quantity, that our superior weapons and superior soldiers would be enough. But standing in that Field in Normandy, watching them come through the fog, hundreds of them, thousands of them, I knew we were finished. Not because the Sherman was a good tank, because there were so many of them that it did not matter whether they were good or not. The Sherman tank was never supposed to be a symbol. It was supposed to be a tool, a means to an end, a standardized component in the vast industrial machine that America had constructed to win the war. But symbols are not chosen. They emerge from the intersection of intention and consequence. And in the fields of France, in the forests of the Ardennes, in the rubble of German cities, the Sherman became something more than a tool. It became the physical manifestation of a particular kind of power. Not the power of technological superiority or martial excellence, but the power of abundance, the power of a system so vast and so productive that it could absorb any loss and continue functioning. The Germans had built the finest tanks in the world, and it had not mattered. They had trained the finest tank crews in the world, and it had not mattered. They had developed tactical doctrines that were studied and admired by military theorists for decades after the war, and it had not mattered. Because in the end, the war was not decided by the quality of weapons or the skill of soldiers. It was decided by the capacity of industrial systems, by the ability to produce and deliver material in quantities that overwhelmed all other considerations. 50,000 Shermans rolled across France, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily, inexorably, in a mechanical tide that no amount of German tactical brilliance or technological sophistication could reverse. Each one was a death trap. Each one could be, and often was, knocked out by a single well-placed shot from a German tank. But for every Sherman that burned, another arrived from the ports, and another after that, and another, until the Germans stopped counting, until they stopped believing their own propaganda about
quality over quantity, until they looked at the horizon and saw nothing but American steel stretching as far as the eye could see, and understood that the war was over. The Sherman tank was not a weapon. It was an argument that democracies could outproduce dictatorships, that free industrial economies could mobilize resources in ways that command economies could not match, that the future of warfare belonged not to the craftsmen building masterpieces, but to the engineers building systems. It was an argument made in steel and diesel and the bodies of young men who climbed into those tanks knowing they might not come back, but trusting that their sacrifice would mean something because the system was larger than any individual, more durable than any single loss, and capable of delivering victory through sheer, overwhelming mechanical persistence. And history recorded that the argument was correct.